Baby discovered a bear cub, hidden in an orphanage attic. What he did next, found family for both. The old Sunbeam Orphanage stood at the edge of a town, its weathered brick walls holding stories that went back nearly 100 years. Rain tapped against the windows that October evening, creating tiny rivers that ran down the glass like tears of joy rather than sadness. Inside, the warmth from the ancient radiators filled every corner with a comforting heat that made the whole building feel like a giant embrace. Lily Morgan moved through the hallways with practiced quiet, her soft slippers barely making a sound on the worn wooden floors that had been polished by countless small feet over the decades. She had been working at the orphanage for 5 years now, and in all that time she had never encountered a child quite like Jacob Bennett. The baby was only 8 months old, but there was something different about him, something in the way his bright eyes followed every movement, every shadow, every beam of light that danced across the ceiling. Other babies his age would cry for milk or attention, but Jacob seemed to communicate through gentle touches and the softest of sounds, almost like he understood the world in a way that went beyond his months. That particular evening started like any other, with Lily preparing bottles for the younger children and checking on each room before the night truly settled in. The orphanage housed 12 children at the moment, ranging from Jacob's 8 months to teenagers preparing to venture into the world on their own. Each child had their own story of how they arrived at Sunbeam, stories that Lily kept close to her heart like precious photographs. She paused outside Jacob's room, peering through the slightly open door to check on him. He was supposed to be sleeping, but instead she found him sitting up in his crib, his tiny hands pressed against the wooden bars, his head tilted upward toward the ceiling. His eyes were focused on something above, something that seemed to hold his complete attention. Lily followed his gaze but saw nothing except the familiar water stain that had been there since before she started working. She entered the room quietly, expecting him to turn toward her with his usual gentle smile, but Jacob remained fixated on the ceiling, his small body completely still, except for the rise and fall of his chest. "What are you looking at, sweet one?" Lily whispered, reaching down to stroke his soft hair that reminded her of corn silk in the summer sun. Jacob finally turned to her, but instead of smiling, he raised one chubby finger and pointed upward, making a soft sound that wasn't quite a word, but seemed to carry meaning nonetheless. Lily looked up again, studying the ceiling more carefully this time. The orphanage had 3 floors, with the children's rooms on the 2nd floor and storage rooms on the 3rd. Above Jacob's room would be the old attic, a space that had been sealed off years ago due to structural concerns. Nobody had been up there in at least a decade, according to the records she had seen when she first started working. As she stood there contemplating the ceiling, a faint sound drifted down. So quiet she almost thought she had imagined it. It was like a gentle scratching, followed by what could have been a soft whimper. Jacob made another sound, this one more insistent, his tiny hand still pointing upward as if he knew something was there, something that needed attention. The next few nights followed the same pattern, with Jacob refusing to sleep properly, constantly watching the ceiling with those knowing eyes. Lily found herself listening too, catching those same faint sounds that seemed to come and go like whispers in the wind. She mentioned it to the director, but was told the attic had been checked years ago and there was nothing up there but old furniture and dust. Still, the sounds continued, growing slightly louder each night, and Jacob's restlessness increased along with them. On the 5th night, Lily made a decision that would change everything. After all the other children were asleep and the night staff had settled into their routines, she retrieved the old keyring from the director's office, the one that held keys to every door in the building, including the sealed attic. Her hands trembled slightly as she climbed the narrow staircase to the third floor, past the storage rooms filled with donated clothes and old toys, to the door at the end of the hallway that hadn't been opened in years. The key turned with surprising ease, and the door swung open to reveal another staircase, this one even narrower and covered in a thick layer of dust. Lily climbed carefully, using her phone's flashlight to guide her way, each step creaking under her weight. The attic was larger than she expected, filled with sheet-covered furniture and boxes stacked to the rafters. Moonlight filtered through a small window, creating long shadows that danced as she moved her light around the space. She was about to turn back, convinced she had been imagining things when she heard it clearly for the first time. It was definitely a whimper, soft and frightened, coming from somewhere near the far wall. Lily moved toward the sound, her heart beating faster with each step. Behind an old wardrobe, she found a large wooden chest, its lid slightly ajar. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid completely and gasped at what she saw inside. Curled up on a bed of old blankets was a bear cub, no bigger than a small dog. Its fur matted and dirty, its eyes wide with fear. The cub looked up at her and made that same whimpering sound she had been hearing for days. Lily stood frozen, her mind trying to process what she was seeing. A bear cub in the orphanage attic was impossible, yet here it was, clearly real and clearly in distress. The cub was thin, its ribs visible through its fur, and there were empty cans scattered around the chest, suggesting someone had been feeding it at some point. But who? And why? As she stood there, the cub tried to stand, but stumbled, too weak to support itself properly. Without thinking, Lily reached into the chest and gently lifted the small creature, surprised by how light it was. The cub didn't resist, instead pressing its small head against her chest, as if seeking comfort. She carried the cub down to the kitchen, moving as quietly as possible to avoid waking anyone. In the bright light of the kitchen, she could see the cub more clearly. It was definitely a black bear cub, probably only a few months old, and it was in desperate need of care. She warmed some milk and offered it in a bowl, watching as the cub lapped it up eagerly, its small pink tongue working quickly. As the cub drank, Lily's mind raced with questions and concerns. She couldn't call animal control. They would take the cub away immediately, and something about that felt wrong. This little creature had somehow ended up in their attic, had somehow survived there, and Jacob had known. Somehow, that baby had sensed another young life in need of help. When the cub finished drinking, it looked up at her with eyes that seemed almost grateful, then curled up on the kitchen floor and fell asleep almost instantly. Lily sat on the floor beside the sleeping cub, trying to figure out what to do next. She couldn't keep a bear cub in the orphanage kitchen, but she also couldn't bear the thought of sending this helpless creature away. As she sat there thinking, she heard soft footsteps on the stairs. Her heart jumped, but it was only Maria, one of the older girls who sometimes helped with the younger children. Maria stopped in the doorway, her eyes widening at the sight of the bear cub, but instead of screaming or running away, she moved closer, kneeling down beside Lily. "Is it real?" she whispered, reaching out a tentative hand to touch the cub's fur. Lily nodded, still not quite believing it herself. Maria sat down beside her, and together they watched the cub sleep, its small body rising and falling with each breath. "We have to help it," Maria said simply, and Lily found herself nodding in agreement. They couldn't explain why, but both felt a deep need to protect this small, vulnerable creature. They decided to move the cub to the old laundry room in the basement, a space that was rarely used and could be easily secured. Together, they carried the sleeping cub downstairs, creating a makeshift bed from old blankets and placing fresh water and more milk within reach. The cub stirred slightly as they set it down but didn't wake, seeming to sense it was safe. Over the next few days, Lily and Maria took turns caring for the cub in secret, bringing food and sitting with it when they could. The cub grew stronger, beginning to play with the old toys they brought down, rolling around and making soft, happy sounds that made them both smile. What amazed Lily most was Jacob's reaction when she finally decided to introduce them. She had been hesitant at first, worried about the safety of bringing a baby near a wild animal, even a small one. But something told her it would be all right, that same instinct that had led her to care for the cub in the first place. She brought Jacob down to the laundry room during his usual nap time, when the rest of the orphanage was quiet. The moment Jacob saw the cub, his face lit up with the biggest smile Lily had ever seen from him. He reached out his tiny hands, making soft cooing sounds, and the cub, instead of being frightened, moved closer, sniffing at Jacob's fingers gently. What happened next took Lily's breath away. The cub curled up beside Jacob's carrier, and Jacob reached out to rest his small hand on the cub's fur, both of them completely calm and content. From that day forward, Lily brought Jacob to visit the cub every day, always during the quiet afternoon hours when they were least likely to be discovered. The bond between the baby and the bear cub grew stronger with each visit. Jacob would babble in his baby language, and the cub would respond with gentle grunts and snuffles, as if they were having conversations only they could understand. The cub learned to be gentle with Jacob, never using its claws, always careful when playing. And Jacob, despite being so young, seemed to understand that he needed to be gentle too, patting the cub's fur with surprising care for a baby his age. Lily documented these meetings with her phone, taking photos and videos that she kept hidden, knowing that someday she would need to prove that this incredible friendship was real. As weeks passed, the secret became harder to keep. The cub was growing, requiring more food and space, and its playful nature meant it sometimes made noise that carried through the old building's walls. Lily knew they couldn't keep this up forever, but she didn't know what else to do. The thought of separating Jacob and the cub felt cruel. They had become so attached to each other that Jacob would cry on days when he couldn't visit his friend, and the cub would pace restlessly when Jacob wasn't there. Maria had started researching online, trying to find information about wildlife sanctuaries that might take the cub, but every option seemed to mean the end of this special friendship. They were running out of time and options, and Lily found herself praying for some kind of miracle, some solution that would keep everyone safe and happy. The miracle came in an unexpected form. One morning, the orphanage received a visit from a couple who were interested in adoption. Ethan Marshall and Jessica Brooks were in their early 30s, unable to have children of their own, and had been going through the adoption process for over 2 years. They were different from other prospective parents who had visited. They didn't come with a specific age or gender in mind, instead saying they would know the right child when they met them. Lily showed them around the orphanage, introducing them to various children, but she noticed how Ethan's attention kept drifting to the quieter corners, as if he was listening for something. When they passed by the basement door, he stopped completely, tilting his head. "Do you hear that?" he asked, and Lily's heart nearly stopped. She tried to brush it off, but Jessica had heard it too, a soft scratching sound from below. Before Lily could stop them, Ethan had opened the basement door and was heading down the stairs. Lily followed, her mind racing for explanations, but when they reached the laundry room, the door was already open. Inside, they found Jacob, who had somehow gotten out of his crib and crawled all the way down here on his own, something that should have been impossible for a baby his age. He was sitting with the bear cub, both of them looking up at the adults with innocent eyes. Lily expected screams, panic, calls to animal control, But instead, she saw something else entirely on Ethan and Jessica's faces. Wonder. Ethan slowly knelt down, his movements careful and deliberate, while Jessica stood frozen, her hand over her mouth. "Is this real?" Jessica whispered, echoing Maria's words from weeks ago. The cub, perhaps sensing no threat from these newcomers, stayed close to Jacob, who patted its head as if introducing his friend. "I can explain," Lily began, but Ethan held up his hand gently. "No need," he said softly, his eyes never leaving Jacob and the cub. "I grew up on a wildlife preserve. My parents were conservationists. I've been around bears my whole life." He moved closer slowly, extending his hand for the cub to sniff, which it did curiously before allowing him to pet its head. Jessica finally moved forward too, kneeling beside her husband, tears streaming down her face. "They love each other," she said simply, watching as Jacob leaned against the cub, both of them completely comfortable with these strangers. Lily found herself telling them everything: how Jacob had sensed the cub, how they had found it starving in the attic, how the friendship had developed, how impossible it seemed to separate them now. Ethan and Jessica listened without interrupting, their hands finding each other as the story unfolded. When Lily finished, they looked at each other, having one of those wordless conversations that couples who truly know each other can have. Then Jessica turned to Lily with a smile that seemed to light up the dim laundry room. "We have 40 acres of land outside the city," she said. "It's fenced, private, with woods and a stream. We were planning to start a small animal sanctuary eventually, but maybe we could start sooner." Ethan nodded, adding, "I still have contacts at various wildlife organizations. We could get the proper permits, make sure everything is legal and safe. The cub could grow up naturally but safely, and Jacob—" He paused, looking at the baby who was now yawning, his small hand still resting on his friend's fur. Jacob could grow up with his best friend. The process wasn't simple or quick. There were legal hurdles, inspections, permits to obtain, and procedures to follow. But Ethan and Jessica threw themselves into it with a determination that impressed everyone at the orphanage. They visited every day, spending time not just with Jacob but with the cub too, learning its personality, its needs. They consulted with wildlife experts, veterinarians, and legal advisors. They modified their property, creating a large enclosed area where the cub could roam safely as it grew, with a special shelter that connected to the house through a secure passage. The local authorities were skeptical at first, but Ethan's background and connections, combined with the unique circumstances and the clear bond between the boy and the bear, eventually won them over. A special permit was granted, with regular check-ins required to ensure the safety of everyone involved. During this time, something beautiful happened. As Ethan and Jessica spent more time at the orphanage, they didn't just bond with Jacob, they fell in love with him completely. They learned his gentle nature, his unusual awareness of the world around him, his incredible capacity for love. They saw how he was with the other children too, always sharing, always gentle, seeming to sense when someone needed comfort, even though he was still so young himself. The adoption papers were filed alongside the wildlife permits, two processes moving in parallel toward the same goal: creating an unusual but loving family. The other children at the orphanage were let in on the secret gradually, and their reactions ranged from amazement to delight. They all took turns visiting the cub, always supervised, and it became the orphanage's most treasured secret. The day finally came when all the paperwork was complete, all the permits approved, and Jacob and the cub, who had been officially named Bruno by the children's vote, could leave the orphanage together. It was bittersweet for Lily, who had come to love them both so much, but the joy on Jacob's face when he realized he and Bruno were going to the same home was worth any sadness. The other children gathered to say goodbye, some crying, others laughing, as Bruno performed his latest trick of rolling over for belly rubs. Maria, who had been part of the secret from the beginning, hugged Lily tight. "You saved them both," she whispered, but Lily shook her head. "They saved each other," she replied, watching as Ethan carefully placed Jacob in his car seat while Jessica led Bruno to the special transport they had arranged. The drive to their new home was filled with Jacob's happy babbling and Bruno's excited snuffles from his secure carrier. When they arrived at the property, both were released into their new world together. The house was beautiful, but what made it special was how it had been adapted for their unique family. The enclosed area for Bruno was massive, with trees to climb, a pond to play in, and the special shelter that would allow him to be close to the family even as he grew. Jacob's nursery had a large window looking out onto Bruno's area, and a secure viewing room had been built where they could safely spend time together as Bruno grew larger. That first night, Jacob slept better than he ever had at the orphanage, knowing his friend was just outside his window, and Bruno, for the first time since being found in that dusty attic, slept without fear, knowing he was home. As weeks turned to months, the family settled into their unique rhythm. Ethan worked from home, allowing him to supervise the daily interactions between Jacob and Bruno. Jessica documented everything, creating a blog that gained worldwide attention. The story of the boy and the bear who grew up as brothers. They were careful to emphasize the special circumstances, the professional oversight, and the safety measures in place, not wanting others to think keeping wild animals as pets was acceptable. But they also shared the magic of watching Jacob take his first steps with Bruno beside him, of seeing Bruno learn to fish in his pond while Jacob cheered from behind the safety glass, of the quiet moments when both would nap in the sunshine, separated by reinforced glass but still together. Wildlife experts who visited were amazed by Bruno's development. He was learning natural bear behaviors while maintaining his gentle bond with his human family. Jacob grew from a baby to a toddler, and his first clear word wasn't mama or dada, it was Bruno. The bear, growing rapidly but still gentle with his small human brother, seemed to understand that Jacob was fragile, always careful during their supervised interactions. Ethan taught Jacob about bear behavior, about respect for wildlife, about the responsibility that came with their unique situation. Jessica made sure Jacob understood that Bruno was special, that not all bears were like his brother, that their situation was one of a kind. They were honest with Jacob from the beginning, age-appropriately explaining how Bruno came to be with them, why he couldn't live like other bears, but also why their bond was something to be treasured. The local community, initially skeptical, came to embrace the unusual family, especially after Ethan and Jessica opened their property for educational visits, teaching children about wildlife conservation and the importance of protecting natural habitats. By the time Jacob was 3, he and Bruno had developed their own form of communication. Jacob would stand at the viewing window and make certain gestures, and Bruno would respond with specific behaviors. They played games through the glass, Bruno hiding objects for Jacob to find when he next entered the secure interaction area, Jacob leaving paintings he made at preschool for Bruno to investigate. The bond never weakened, even as Bruno grew into a magnificent adult bear. If anything, it evolved into something even more beautiful, a mutual respect and love that transcended species. Veterinarians and animal behaviorists who studied them said it was unprecedented, a testament to the power of early bonding and consistent, careful management. Bruno was a wild animal who had never quite been wild, and Jacob was a boy who understood bears better than most experts. The story could have ended there, a happy ending for all involved, but life had more surprises in store. When Jacob was 5, Ethan and Jessica received a call from Lily at the orphanage. Another unusual situation had arisen. This time, an injured hawk that a child had been secretly caring for in the garden shed. Remembering how Jacob and Bruno's story had begun, they didn't hesitate. Soon, their sanctuary had its second resident, and Jacob had a new friend to introduce to Bruno. Over the years, their property became a haven for animals that couldn't be released into the wild, but deserved better than life in a cage. Each new arrival was carefully introduced, proper permits obtained, and Jacob grew up surrounded by creatures that taught him about compassion, responsibility, and the interconnectedness of all life. Looking back, Lily often wondered about the circumstances that had brought that bear cub to the orphanage attic. They never did find out how it got there, or who had been caring for it before it was abandoned. Some mysteries, she decided, didn't need solving. What mattered was that two young souls had found each other when they needed it most, and from that connection, an entire family had been born. She stayed in touch with them all, visiting often, watching Jacob grow into a remarkable young man who would eventually study veterinary medicine and wildlife conservation, inspired by his unusual childhood. Bruno lived a long, happy life, far exceeding the typical lifespan of bears in captivity, perhaps because he had something most bears never experienced, a true family. The impact of their story rippled outward in ways they never expected. The blog Jessica had started became a book, then a documentary, inspiring changes in how wildlife rehabilitation centers operated, showing that, with proper care and respect, the bonds between humans and animals could be both safe and transformative. Other orphanages began programs connecting children with animal therapy, finding that the children who had experienced loss and abandonment often formed powerful healing connections with rescued animals. Ethan and Jessica went on to adopt 2 more children from Sunbeam Orphanage, siblings who had arrived after Jacob's time, and these children too grew up with Bruno and the other sanctuary animals as part of their extended family. The house on those 40 acres became a place where the impossible became possible, where love didn't follow conventional rules. Jacob never forgot those early days when it was just him and Bruno against the world, a baby and a cub who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. Even as a teenager, he would sometimes sleep in the viewing room, falling asleep to the sound of Bruno's breathing, just as he had as a baby in that orphanage laundry room. Their bond proved that family isn't always about blood or even species. Sometimes it's about recognizing a kindred spirit and choosing to protect and love them no matter what. The orphanage staff would tell the story to new children who arrived scared and alone, showing them pictures of Jacob and Bruno, proof that sometimes the most unexpected connections lead to the most beautiful destinations. And in his own way, Bruno seemed to understand his role in this larger story, always gentle with the new children who visited, as if he remembered being small and scared and alone, until a baby's instinct led to his rescue. As Jacob grew older, he began to understand the magnitude of what had happened. He researched everything he could about interspecies bonding, about the cognitive abilities of bears, about the various theories that might explain the almost mystical connection he shared with Bruno. But in the end, he realized that some things transcended scientific explanation. What he and Bruno had was simply love, pure and uncomplicated, the kind that didn't need words or even the same species to flourish. He gave talks at schools and universities, sharing their story not as a template to be replicated, but as a reminder that compassion and connection can bloom in the most unexpected places. He always emphasized the unique circumstances, the professional oversight, The years of careful management that had made their situation possible, never wanting anyone to think they could simply adopt a wild animal. The sanctuary grew over the years, becoming a respected rehabilitation and education center. Jacob worked there every summer through high school and college, learning from the professionals Ethan hired, but also bringing his own unique understanding of the animals. He could sense when something was wrong with one of the residents before symptoms became obvious, a skill the veterinarians learned to trust. Bruno, aging gracefully, became the patriarch of the sanctuary, his calm presence seeming to soothe new arrivals. Visitors were always amazed to see the massive bear gently interact with Jacob, their bond evident in every gesture and glance. The sanctuary's mission statement, written by Jacob when he was 16, read, "Every creature deserves compassion. Every bond deserves respect, and every life has value beyond measure." One particularly meaningful moment came when Jacob was 18, about to leave for college. He sat with Bruno in the secure interaction area, both of them older, both of them changed by the years but still connected by that invisible thread that had drawn them together as infants. Jacob talked to Bruno about his plans, his dreams of becoming a veterinarian specializing in wildlife, his hope to create more sanctuaries like theirs. Bruno listened, occasionally making the soft rumbling sound that Jacob knew meant contentment. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jacob realized that this was what home meant. Not just a place, but a feeling of belonging so complete that even temporary separation couldn't break it. He knew that no matter where life took him, he would always return to this place, to this bear who had been his first friend, his protector, his brother in all but blood. The story of Jacob and Bruno became required reading in several university courses on animal behavior and human-animal bonds. Researchers came to study them, trying to understand what made their relationship so successful when so many others had failed. The answer, Jessica always told them, was simple: respect, consistency, and love. They had never tried to make Bruno human or treated Jacob like a bear. They had honored what each was while creating a safe space for their bond to exist. This philosophy became the foundation of the sanctuary's approach to all its residents. Every animal was seen as an individual with its own needs and personality. Every interaction was based on mutual respect, and every decision was made with both safety and emotional well-being in mind. Years passed, and the sanctuary became a pilgrimage site of sorts for people who had heard the story and wanted to see for themselves that such a bond was possible. Jacob, now Dr. Bennett, would give tours when he was home, sharing not just the facts but the feeling of growing up with Bruno. He would talk about the responsibility that came with their unique situation, the sacrifices his parents had made, the constant vigilance required to keep everyone safe. But he would also share the joy. The morning, Bruno had figured out how to open his puzzle feeder and was so proud he did a little dance. The day, Jacob had been bullied at school and came home to find Bruno waiting at their usual spot as if he knew his boy needed comfort. The countless quiet moments of simple companionship that had shaped both their lives. The impact on the adoption community was significant too. Ethan and Jessica's story inspired other prospective parents to consider children with unique circumstances or special needs. They showed that sometimes what seems like a complication can become the very thing that makes a family special. They were often invited to speak at adoption events, sharing how their willingness to embrace the unexpected had led them to Jacob and the beautiful, unusual family they had created. They always credited Lily for her courage in protecting both Jacob and Bruno when it would have been easier to follow protocol. Lily, who had eventually become the director of Sunbeam Orphanage, implemented new policies that encouraged creative solutions for children with special circumstances, always within legal and safety guidelines but with more flexibility than before. As Bruno entered his senior years, the family began to prepare for the inevitable. Bears in captivity could live up to 30 years, and Bruno, with his excellent care, had already exceeded expectations. Jacob, now married with children of his own, brought his kids to meet their Uncle Bruno, teaching them the same lessons of respect and wonder he had learned. Bruno, though slower now, still recognized Jacob's children, was still gentle with them, still had that spark of intelligence in his eyes that had captivated everyone from the beginning. The sanctuary had protocols in place for when the time came, but nothing could truly prepare them for saying goodbye to the bear who had started it all. They focused instead on celebrating every day they still had together, creating new memories while cherishing the old ones. One spring morning, when Jacob was 32 and Bruno was approaching 30 himself, they had what would be their last real interaction. Bruno was tired, spending most of his time sleeping in his favorite sunny spot. But when Jacob entered the enclosure, the old bear lifted his head and made that familiar rumbling sound. Jacob sat beside him, not saying anything, just being present the way they had been for each other since before either could properly remember. Bruno rested his massive head on Jacob's lap, something he hadn't done since he was small, and Jacob stroked his fur, feeling the heartbeat that had been part of his life's rhythm for as long as he could remember. They stayed that way for hours. The man and the bear, two souls who had found each other in the most unlikely way and had never let go. When Bruno passed peacefully a few weeks later, the entire community mourned. The sanctuary held a memorial service that drew hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the story of the boy and the bear. Jacob spoke about gratitude for the years they had shared, for the parents who had made it possible, for Lily who had saved them both, for Bruno himself who had taught him about love that transcends every boundary humans create. They buried Bruno in a special place on the property, planting an oak tree that would grow strong and tall, a living memorial to a remarkable life. Jacob's children helped plant the tree, understanding even at their young age that they were part of something special, carriers of a legacy that was about more than just one boy and one bear. The sanctuary continued to thrive, with Jacob eventually taking over as director. He implemented programs that paired at-risk youth with rescued animals, seeing in each connection an echo of what he and Bruno had shared. Not every pairing was as dramatic as theirs had been, but each one mattered. Each one had the potential to change lives. The viewing room, where he and Bruno had spent so many hours, was converted into an education center, its walls covered with photos documenting their journey from that first meeting in the orphanage laundry room to their final goodbye. Visitors often left in tears, moved by the evidence of a love that had seemed impossible but had been absolutely real. Jessica's book about their experience became a bestseller, with all proceeds going to support both the sanctuary and Sunbeam Orphanage. In it, she wrote about the courage it takes to embrace the unconventional, the strength required to protect something precious that others might not understand, and the joy that comes from allowing love to exist in whatever form it takes. She wrote about Ethan's steady presence, his expertise that had made everything possible, and his unwavering belief that they were meant to be Jacob and Bruno's family. She wrote about Lily's bravery, Maria's compassion, and the community that had eventually embraced their strange little family. But mostly, she wrote about Jacob and Bruno themselves, two souls who had recognized each other across the divide of species and had held on with a determination that had changed everyone around them. The research that came from studying Jacob and Bruno's relationship contributed to new understanding of animal cognition and emotional capacity. Papers were published, conferences were held, and slowly, The scientific community began to accept what those who knew them had always understood, that the emotional lives of animals were far richer and more complex than previously believed. The sanctuary became a research center, always with the welfare of the animals as the priority, but contributing valuable data that helped improve conditions for captive wildlife worldwide. Jacob insisted that Bruno's legacy be one of knowledge and compassion, that his life continued to make a difference even after he was gone. Looking back on it all, sitting in his office at the sanctuary with Bruno's photo on his desk and the sound of the current residents playing outside his window, Jacob often thought about that baby he had been, somehow knowing there was a friend in need above his crib. He thought about the cub, alone and frightened in that dusty attic, holding on until help arrived. He thought about all the moments of synchronicity that had to align for their story to unfold as it had. Lily checking on him at just the right moment, having the courage to investigate, finding the cub before it was too late, Maria keeping the secret, Ethan and Jessica arriving when they did with exactly the right background and resources, the community eventually supporting rather than condemning their unusual arrangement. It seemed impossible that it had all worked out. Yet here he was, living proof that sometimes the impossible becomes inevitable when love is involved. The sanctuary's mission expanded over the years to include education programs that traveled to schools, teaching children about wildlife conservation, the importance of habitat preservation, and the delicate balance between human development and animal welfare. Jacob would often tell Bruno's story during these presentations, watching young faces light up with wonder and determination. He would explain how Bruno had been failed by humans initially. Whoever had captured him as a cub, kept him in that attic, then abandoned him, but had also been saved by humans who chose compassion over convenience. He would talk about the responsibility that comes with power over other creatures, the importance of making choices that consider the welfare of all living things. And always, he would emphasize that while their story was special, the real magic was in everyday acts of kindness toward animals, in choosing to coexist rather than dominate. The ripple effects continued spreading. Other sanctuaries adopted their protocols for managing human-animal bonds in rescue situations. Orphanages implemented programs connecting children with animals under careful supervision. Wildlife rehabilitation centers began considering the emotional as well as physical needs of their patients. The story of Jacob and Bruno became a touchstone for discussions about what we owe to the other species sharing our planet. It challenged people to think beyond traditional boundaries, to consider that perhaps the divisions we create between human and animal, between possible and impossible, between conventional and extraordinary, are more fluid than we imagine. Their story asked a simple question. What if we approached every interaction with openness to connection, rather than assumption of separation? As the years passed and Jacob watched his own children grow, he saw them develop their own relationships with the sanctuary animals, not as intense or unusual as his bond with Bruno, but meaningful in their own ways. His daughter had a special connection with an injured owl that wouldn't interact with anyone else. His son could calm the nervous rescue horses with just his presence. They were growing up understanding that every creature had its own personality, its own fears and joys, its own capacity for connection. They learned responsibility by helping with daily care, empathy by observing the animal's different needs, and respect by understanding the boundaries necessary for safety. They knew their Uncle Bruno's story by heart, but more importantly, they understood its message, that love doesn't always look like what we expect, but that doesn't make it any less real or valuable. The old laundry room at Sunbeam Orphanage was eventually converted into a small memorial space with photos of Jacob and Bruno and a plaque telling their story. New children arriving at the orphanage would be taken there, shown that miracles could happen, that families could form in the most unexpected ways. Lily, even in her retirement, would sometimes visit and sit in that room, remembering the night she found a bear cub in the attic and the baby who had somehow known it was there. She had gone on to facilitate many more adoptions, some conventional, others less so, but none had ever matched the magic of Jacob and Bruno. She kept in touch with all her children as she thought of them, but Jacob held a special place. The boy whose extraordinary empathy had led to an impossible friendship that had changed so many lives. The documentary about their story won several awards and was translated into dozens of languages, spreading their message globally. It inspired conservation efforts in countries where wildlife and human populations were in conflict, showing that coexistence was possible with creativity, respect, and commitment. Jacob was invited to speak at international conferences, sharing not just their story but the practical lessons learned from it. He talked about the importance of early intervention in wildlife rescue, the critical nature of proper facilities and expertise, the need for legal frameworks that could accommodate unusual situations while maintaining safety standards. But he always returned to the heart of it, that compassion and connection were universal languages that transcended species boundaries. On the 20th anniversary of Bruno's passing, the sanctuary held a celebration of life that drew visitors from around the world. The oak tree planted at his grave had grown tall and strong, its branches providing shade for a new generation of rescued animals. Jacob, now in his 50s with gray threading through his hair, stood before the crowd and spoke about legacy. He talked about how one scared cub and one intuitive baby had created ripples that were still spreading, still changing lives, still challenging assumptions about what was possible. He announced a new scholarship program in Bruno's name, supporting students studying wildlife conservation and veterinary medicine. He unveiled plans for an expansion that would allow the sanctuary to rescue more animals and educate more people. And he shared previously unseen footage from those early days, including the first video Lily had taken of him and Bruno together. Two infants comforting each other in a world that hadn't been kind to either of them. The audience was silent as they watched that grainy footage, seeing the beginning of something extraordinary in the gentle touch between baby and cub. Many were crying by the end, moved by the purity of that early connection and everything it had led to. Jacob's own children, now adults themselves, spoke about growing up in the shadow of such a remarkable story, how it had shaped their own paths and values. His daughter had become a wildlife photographer, documenting human-animal connections around the world. His son was studying environmental law, working to create legal protections for wildlife habitats. They talked about Uncle Bruno not as a pet or even as an animal, but as a family member who had taught them about courage, loyalty, and love without conditions. The sanctuary's influence extended into policy-making, with Jacob serving as an advisor on legislation regarding wildlife rehabilitation and exotic animal ownership. He worked to close loopholes that allowed private individuals to keep dangerous animals as pets while creating provisions for legitimate sanctuaries and rehabilitation centers. He testified before Congress about the importance of funding wildlife conservation, using Bruno's story to illustrate the profound connections possible between humans and animals when approached with respect and proper knowledge. His testimony helped pass several important bills that increased protections for endangered species and funding for wildlife rehabilitation. Through it all, he carried Bruno's memory as both inspiration and responsibility, knowing that their story had given him a platform that he was obligated to use for good. The children who had grown up visiting the sanctuary often returned as adults, bringing their own children to learn about the boy and the bear, who had shown the world that family could take many forms. Some became veterinarians, conservationists, or educators themselves, crediting those early visits with sparking their passion for animal welfare. The sanctuary's guest book filled with stories of how Jacob and Bruno's tale had influenced major life decisions, healed old wounds, or simply reminded people that magic still existed in the world. Teachers used their story in lessons about empathy, responsibility, and environmental stewardship. Therapists referenced it when working with children who felt different or alone. Writers and artists found inspiration in the improbable beauty of their connection. As Jacob entered his 60s, he began working on a comprehensive memoir, wanting to preserve not just the facts of their story but the feeling of it. He wrote about the sensation of Bruno's fur under his childhood hands, the sound of the bear's contented rumbles, the weight of that massive head on his lap during their final meeting. He wrote about the fear that had sometimes accompanied their bond, fear of Bruno being taken away, fear of something going wrong, fear of losing this creature who had become so central to his identity. He wrote about the joy, too, the pure, uncomplicated happiness of being understood by another soul, regardless of species. He wrote about his parents, their unwavering support and sacrifice, and about Lily, whose courage had saved them both. He wrote about the responsibility of being the guardian of such a story, of carrying it forward in a way that honored both Bruno's memory and the ongoing work of conservation. The memoir became more than just their story. It became a meditation on the relationship between humans and the natural world. Jacob explored how their bond had been possible only because of human interference. Bruno should never have been in that attic, should have been with his mother in the wild. Yet, from that tragedy had come something beautiful, a reminder that even our mistakes could be transformed into opportunities for grace. He wrote about the paradox of loving a wild animal while knowing it could never truly be wild, the complexity of providing a good life for a creature whose natural life had been stolen. He didn't shy away from the ethical questions their story raised, instead engaging with them honestly and thoughtfully, acknowledging that there were no perfect answers, only choices made with love and the best knowledge available at the time. The book's publication coincided with the sanctuary's 40th anniversary, a milestone that seemed impossible when Ethan and Jessica had first brought home a baby and a bear cub. The celebration lasted a week, with educational programs, conservation workshops, and storytelling sessions where people shared their own experiences of unexpected animal connections. Jacob, now a grandfather himself, watched his grandchildren play in the same spaces where he and Bruno had once played, saw them form their own bonds with the sanctuary's current residents, and felt the continuity of something precious being passed down through generations. The sanctuary had become more than just a place. It had become a living testament to the power of compassion and the possibility of connection across all boundaries. On the final evening of the anniversary celebration, Jacob stood in the viewing room where he and Bruno had spent so many hours. The walls were now covered with photos spanning decades. Bruno as a tiny cub, Jacob as a baby, their parallel growth through childhood and adolescence, their reunion visits during Jacob's college years, their quiet moments in Bruno's final years. But there were also photos of all the animals that had come after, all the children who had visited, all the lives that had been touched by their story. Jacob realized that this was Bruno's true legacy, not just their individual bond, but the countless connections that had followed, the minds that had been opened, the hearts that had been changed. Bruno had been the first, but he had not been the last, and in that continuity was a kind of immortality. Looking out at the sanctuary grounds in the fading light, Jacob could see the current residents settling for the night, the rescued wolves in their expansive enclosure, the rehabilitated eagles in their flight cage, the orphaned deer in the meadow. Each had their own story of loss and rescue, their own journey to this place of safety. Some would eventually be released back to the wild. Others would live out their lives here. but all would receive the same respect and care that Bruno had received. The staff, many of whom had been inspired by Bruno's story to pursue careers in animal care, moved through their evening routines with the quiet efficiency of people who loved their work. The sanctuary ran on donations from people around the world who had been moved by the story of the boy and the bear, people who might never visit but wanted to be part of something meaningful. As night fell, Jacob made his way to Bruno's grave, as he did every evening when he was at the sanctuary. The oak tree had grown magnificent, its branches reaching toward the stars. He sat on the bench they had placed there, feeling the presence of his old friend in the rustle of leaves, in the distant sounds of the sanctuary's residents, in the very air of this place they had made together. He talked to Bruno sometimes, updating him on the sanctuary's progress, on his grandchildren's adventures, on the state of conservation efforts worldwide. He knew Bruno couldn't hear him, but the ritual brought comfort, a continuation of conversations that had begun before either of them could properly speak. The impact of their story continued to ripple outward in ways Jacob could never have imagined as that baby pointing at the ceiling of the orphanage. Universities had created courses studying their case. Conservation organizations used their example in fundraising campaigns. Children's books, inspired by their story but fictionalized for young readers, taught lessons about empathy and environmental responsibility. Artists created sculptures and paintings celebrating their bond. Musicians composed pieces inspired by the rhythm of their friendship. Their story had become larger than just two lives. It had become a symbol of possibility, a reminder that connection and love could bloom in the most unexpected places, that the boundaries we assume are fixed might actually be more fluid than we think.